Hello, everyone. Today we are with Alyssa Carson to talk about her book, Ready for Liftoff. Alyssa, we always start these talks with asking the author about the origin of this book, because on page 7071, I like that throughout the book you had little space details, but also recommendations, also your personal story. So, did you write this book all in one go, as a response to people asking you how do you become an astronaut, or was it a piecemeal research collection process?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say it was more of a long-term process just because, I mean, I think the idea had been there for so long. Really the book came from, so many Instagram DMs, and anytime I'd, go and talk to students, they would ask me questions like, how do I do that? How do I become, what you're doing? And, I really always had the mentality of, you can do exactly everything that I did or nothing that I did and end up in the exact same position because the space industry is so broad and really there's so much opportunity. And so it's kind of hard to guide that discussion with every single person. It's like, sure, this is what I did, but what do you want to do? What are you interested in? And so I think for a while it was just, maybe having like general like quick notes about responding to those Instagram DMs, and it's like, okay, how can I expand on that? And then really a lot of this came from, there was almost like a, I guess more of like a pre-book that ended up going up on Amazon, and then this was just a much more like thought out version of that. So it's just kind of been more of a long time coming of getting the ideas and stuff jotted down to hopefully guide that next generation with their own dreams.
Excellent. So now when someone asks, "Oh, how do I become an astronaut?" you can just say, "My book." Just
Yeah,
look at that.
yeah, that is there, or at least obviously have the discussion, but obviously a more in-depth guide is fully in the book.
Excellent. Do you have a question, or would you like to pass?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, nice to meet you. I was just wondering, what is the most common question you've been asked when you do things like this, and how has that changed over how many years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, a few just, obviously curiosity of like, where did the dream come from and how I guess like it kind of progressed to what it is, which so much I also don't even have the answer to because so much of this has like blown up even so far past what I had anticipated a lot of it. But yeah, I think that, and then in general, like advice about going, about trying to pursue a dream in the space and science industry. I think it's just such a intimidating field, or seemingly intimidating, from the outside perspective, especially young kids. I mean, math and science are already intimidating in the classroom. And so then to then think of it as a career, then that's even more of an intimidating conversation. So I think that I tried to bring as much fun and curiosity and that level of the conversation to anything about space, because all that is still there. And so it's really important to kind of not let, I guess, those scary math and science topics be the thing that kind of deters more or deters more students away from space. So
One of my favorite parts of your book was that you had a very measured and reasonable perspective on the element of luck in being chosen as an astronaut. And you even were very honest in saying you struggled with physics, and so you pivoted into astrobiology. So my question is, what do you see yourself working as you wait for each application round of being an astronaut? What kind of profession do you dream of doing next to being an astronaut?
right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that for me, I got interested in astrobiology originally because it was a little bit more broad of a field. I felt that physics already was a little challenging, and astrophysics just felt like I was pigeonholing even more deep into only physics. And so I was very, very fascinated with the idea of maybe staying within a field that was a lot more conducive to just kind of jumping between the different sciences where they, applied the most.
What's it like looking for life on Mars from your perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, and again, for a lot of the more robotic missions. So, really with Mars, Mars has been a area of interest for a very, very long time. And there was the Viking mission that went to Mars that had like a small look for life experiment on it. And it's not very well respected, and it really kind of led to the shift of a mindset of like, okay, why are we looking for life first? Let's understand the planet. Let's learn about its geology first, which I think was a very good shift and why we've had so many missions go to Mars, and now we have climate models, we have so much information. Mars is now the next most studied planet to Earth, so we have so much more information there, and I think that the more we've learned about it, I think a lot of the potential for life leans a lot into Mars's past, right? We think Mars used to be a lot more suitable for life. Obviously, today doesn't really look nearly as welcoming for any type of life. But I think right now the consensus would be that if there were to be a possibility of life, or maybe life at some point in Mars's past, it's likely in the subsurface, right? It's not on the surface where it's exposed to radiation and exposed to these things. And so the subsurface is such a tricky place to get to, and not really a place that we've really explored too much. You see like the Perseverance rover has been, drilling, but I mean, it's inches. We're really gonna have to start looking more deep into the subsurface for any potential for life. And so that's where it's really challenging. Whether that's, a mission that's able to do more of that, or if that's just maybe we have to wait till humans go there to do more of like studies into the subsurface. But then the field of astrobiology is also such a push and pull because there's, concerns. How do we search for life on Mars, but then also bring people there as well, because the planetary protection aspect of it, right? We don't want to think we found life on Mars, but then someone just touched a rock, and we bring our own organisms and our own bacteria there. So it's definitely challenging. I think that there are some regions of Mars that maybe have a little bit more potential for life than maybe others. So I think those regions have been a little bit more, I guess, sacred in a way of not sending as much stuff there, because even the rovers and things that we send, we still think are exposing the planet, at least to a small degree of something. It's hard to get a perfectly sterile rover and land it all the way on Mars. So I think that those areas of concerns are also there. So it's just going to be a little bit of a balance. But yeah, I think the challenge is we're definitely going to have to go and study that subsurface for actual studies of potential life on Mars.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to keep firing away questions. If anyone has a question, you can just raise your hand or send a message in the chat. This is at the end of your book. You talk about, like, when will the first woman walk on the moon? Would you rather be the first woman to walk on the moon or part of the first crew to Mars, and why?
Huh. Interesting. I mean, I think from my perspective at this point, I am just thrilled to be a part of the space industry in any way, shape, or form. I don't think I've really had, much of a innate desire to I have to be the first to do XYZ. I think maybe some of the things that I did when I was younger just kind of came as, not many people had the viewpoint of becoming an astronaut as I think I did, because since I had it at such an early age, if you ask so many astronauts, a lot of them were, they were already test pilots, or they were already scientists in their field. They maybe saw a random application to be an astronaut and they're like, huh, that sounds kind of cool. Let me do that. They maybe had an interest when they were a kid, but they didn't necessarily have that I'm choosing now at a super young age and I'm just going to work solely towards that goal. That was, I think, a little bit more of a new idea or concept about going about wanting to become an astronaut. And I mean, for me, a lot of my interest surrounding Mars really just came from when I was a kid, hearing about the missions to the moon. I was like, well, the moon's taken. What's next? I thought in my young brain, I thought that was the only option, right? I thought Mars was, if I wanted to grow up and become an astronaut one day, I thought my only option was to go to Mars. I thought that would be, really the next place to go, and that things would kind of be lined up to be able to go there. So that's really where a lot of that came from. I mean, I do think a lot of maybe my research background and areas of focus. I mean, my current PhD research is about Mars and potential life on Mars. So I think, a lot of, what I do is very connected to Mars in a way, but, I would never turn down a mission to the moon either. So I guess I'm going to leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you. Back to TJ, who has a question.
Obviously, sending humans to Mars is very expensive. And I was just wondering why, or what's the most defensible reason, in your opinion, why Mars over putting the funding into things that are time sensitive on Earth right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, it's a question that comes up in the space industry, no matter what you're talking about, whether it's money for a mission to Mars, money for a telescope, money for, it doesn't matter what the mission is, right? There's always going to be the conversation of putting the money towards that versus, maybe a different area here on Earth. And I think that, you know, the space industry does do so much, and it's so easy to view these missions as, we're sending the money up there and then we're never seeing it again. But really, NASA does have one of the largest returns of investment from the money that it does spend. And I think that it's all spent wisely, or as wisely as I think it can be. The missions are chosen for, scientific importance. Missions are constantly being pitched to NASA, whether it's, another mission to Mars, another mission to sending something to Venus, sending something to the outer solar system. And so all you essentially have all these scientists and researchers that want kind of a little bit of that pot. But I think that the amount of technology and science gained kind of is as important as a lot of this other stuff, because really we have so much technology because of NASA and the space industry. And all that technology comes back here, right? It's not just going on those missions and never seen again. And I think that that is really one of the best benefits about the space industry, is that it almost forces us to think outside the box to an issue. It may be an issue that we have for living in space as we have here on Earth, but working on it from the space perspective just kind of forces us to think outside the box. And so I think of like a mission to Mars. If we're working on trying to send humans to Mars and putting the money in sending humans to Mars, there's so many technologies that have to be invented in order to make that happen. Whether it's learning how to grow food on Mars, learning how to shield the astronauts from radiation, all those same ideas that we're using to kind of protect humans and keep them on Mars. I think a lot of that can then be translated to Earth problems. So if we're figuring out how to grow food on Mars, hopefully that same thing, we should be able to grow food in so many places here on Earth that maybe struggle more with agriculture. And so I think that it kind of plays to both sides. I don't think choosing space means neglecting Earth. I think that it's for the purpose of keeping all that here and kind of expanding our knowledge. I think kind of the harder things are the questions of just our general curiosity, right? So much of maybe deep space, I would say, is so much of just, we want to know more about light from the Big Bang, and so much of the knowledge we've gained from like the James Webb Space Telescope, right? A lot of that is just like innate curiosity of, are we alone? Where did it all come from? Where is it all going? And I think space kind of answers some of those, but maybe those you could argue are a little bit more subjective. Obviously, that technology of the telescope is still there, but yeah.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you, Alyssa. Yeah, TJ, in the beginning of the book, Alyssa wrote, iodine-based water filters, GPS, and insulin pumps were all NASA's inventions, which I didn't know before reading that those came from NASA.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
it's all
apologize if anything's come up in the book.
No, it's okay. No, I'm just,
on the PhD, busy.
yeah. No. I'm sharing that because the argument, some people say, well, yeah, what has NASA given us, right? That's, and is the cost justified? So Alex has a question, but also real quick before we go to Alex, another TJ and Alyssa, you may appreciate this. We had a talk 2 days ago, and it was brought up that humans spend more on chocolate than all space travel probes combined, in that, like, the transport, retail.
And NASA's budget is actually not that big when you look at it in terms of the government budget. It's pretty insane, actually, how much we're able to do with the budget that there is.
But it's an interesting, what TJ's question real quick before we go to Alex. I think in our minds we see, like, I know many people that see climate change like next to space travel, like those two things are both intellectual, and it's like, yeah, why don't we put the energy into not roasting our planet, right? That's yeah, it's an interesting topic. But I'm babbling. Alex, question for you. A question for Alyssa.
Hey, John, thank you for sending me the link. Alyssa, thank you for being here. I haven't read the book yet. It was a last minute thing. I'm going to make sure to get the book, but I have done my research and followed you for quite some time. I think we have some mutual friends with the IIAS as well, and maybe a couple other places out there. As a person myself pursuing astronaut candidacy with the U.S. military, I know that this whole trip here, if it, to Mars or Moon, you're going to be working as a team. One of the things that I look for in special operations are people, not things, most of the time. For the trip to Mars, what type of personalities are you looking for in your teammates that you would like to take? One things that you will want to give your teammates as far as personality traits and character of yourself that you can bring to the team, and what things are you looking for as well?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I mean, I think for right now, the concept of a mission to Mars, right? Because we're not fully there yet in setting up that mission entirely. But I think that, it's going to be or going to need to be such a diverse team, right? You're going to need a few people with military background, flight background. You're going to need a few people likely with a much more science background for the amount of time that you're on Mars, likely someone maybe with a medical background for, since it's so far away from Earth and such a like longer term mission than a lot of the other ones that we have. So really just such a, I think, diverse group there. I think some of the most important factors is one, really being able to work as a team and obviously be conducive to a team environment. And I think it's so important to be able to step up and, have your role and what you're in charge of, and also the ability to kind of let go from things that other people are in charge of, I think is really important, because at that point, you have experts in so many different fields. And so being able to rely on your teammates for those things, I think is a really important skill set, being able to be like, so and so, that's their job, they're in charge of it. And I'm putting my life, in their hands for whatever parts of the mission that they're in charge of. So yeah, I think it's just really trying to be the best version of yourself to contribute to the team. And I think that that's what I would hope everyone on the team would be doing, is that they're really trying to show up, be the best version of themselves to put in their part of the work, and then we can kind of like come together and be something that's super successful. And I think that, it's so many things in the space industry. I mean, so many of the missions that we've seen previously, they rely so heavily on each other. And so so many astronauts are always saying, it's just exactly like a little family that you start building because of, the extreme environment that you're put in and how much trust you have to have in each other. So yeah, I think just trustworthy, hardworking people is the core of it.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you,
Thank you,
Alyssa.
Alyssa. Thank you, John.
Yeah, great question. The um, this question I think is relevant for Alex too, since he's pursuing being an astronaut. You wrote, Alyssa, that as you pursue your dreams, you'll encounter many closed doors. For you, so to fill everyone in who hasn't read the book, so Alyssa's wanted to be an astronaut since she was 6 years old, and has gone through I think over 1,000 hours of flight. Like you've done a lot of work to prepare yourself. Which has been the most frustrating closed door that you've encountered in your path to be an astronaut, where it's been the most difficult to bounce back?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I think is challenging, I think a lot of people assume, I've kind of had it all figured out since I was 7. But I think along the way, it's been very challenging to really kind of figure out exactly what I'm interested in doing and how to get there. I think that so much of my journey seems, very like premeditated in a way, but really it's just been having to kind of bounce and kind of go with the flow as things have come up. I think that my interests have kind of constantly been evolving. I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do professionally, I think, for the longest time. And I think that was also very challenging and a little scary going into college to begin with, because I felt like I was, really choosing astrobiology. I knew that that was an area of interest, but I still really didn't know what that career path looks like. And spending so much time in academia, you almost lose sight of what a professional endeavor will eventually be like. And so sometimes I think that that's really hard to kind of shift your mindset back and forth between what it's all leading up to and what that career path really looks like. So I think that's been one of the most challenging things. I think that there's such a balance to it all of, obviously working towards your dreams and your endeavors, also having that normal life and those being a bit of a balance. But yeah, I think, when I was younger, I think I had, what I wanted originally of like where I wanted to go to college and things like that. And so many of those shifted. And, whether that was like a full slam in the door or like the door slamming closed or just, maybe my interest changed, but it was just kind of, okay, now let me rethink what I was going to do. Even recently, I guess, with starting a PhD program, I didn't have the original idea of pursuing a PhD at this time. And I didn't even know it was an option. I think that so much of this just comes from not really having a good understanding of, what your options are. But I had no idea that I could go straight from my undergrad and start a PhD program. And so I started applying as a master's program. And then, I was starting to hear back from so many professors like, oh, we're not going to take master's students because you just aren't here long enough and it's not worth our time. And so, it was just kind of a shift of like, okay, wait, what am I doing? Because my set plan that I originally had is all kind of falling apart. It's not exactly what I was thinking was just the straight and easy path. And so, yeah, I think there's just really, I think those closed doors really are just maybe what I had in my head is kind of shifting and just being able to kind of reroute and figure out, okay, let's take a step back. What do I want to do? What makes the most sense? And then kind of go from there. So I think that that's been just part of life, honestly. I don't think it's necessarily just for, wanting to become an astronaut or my dream specifically. I think that's just kind of part of life and being able to kind of move with some of those changes.
Thank you. Yes, and for those who haven't read the book, another thing I liked in the book, Alyssa, is that and I've never seen this before, you lined out exactly what the requirements are by NASA for even applying. And one, I know this, you need a master's or PhD in a STEM-related field. You need 1,000 hours of flight time, I think, and you need to pass a physical test. So that was interesting. Here's a much lighter question. So in the book, you write that nothing is as comfortable as a good meal, and that astronauts are allowed to have one comfort meal that like they bring to space with them. What is your comfort meal that you would bring if you were going to Mars and you
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. Well, it's hard because so a lot of times the astronauts get to pitch what they want, right? So they get to pitch maybe a food item that they really like, and then it's up to then the super smart people to figure out, can we bring this food to space, right? Because there are a few things that are just kind of hard nose or we aren't able to figure out.
like bread, right? Bread is a no-no because of the crumbs and the yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so like bread is like a really big one, so they use tortillas instead. So I mean, there's compromise there, but yeah, so there's been a lot of time where astronauts will kind of pitch an idea. I know Samantha Cristoforetti, I'm pretty sure. She was an Italian astronaut. She went to the International Space Station and she was like, I need espresso. She was very into having her espresso. And so they started figuring out, okay, how do we make an espresso machine work in microgravity? And so it's kind of like these little fun, I guess, projects that they work on for some of those things. But yeah, I mean, I think comfort food wise, I mean, I obviously would love to have some of my Louisiana roots up there if possible, whether that's a gumbo or something like that would be awesome to have in space. Um, I mean, I think I like soups in general, so I wouldn't really mind anything like that. But yeah, I think any sort of like Louisiana food, whatever would be the easiest, I would be open. I'd be open to, if a gumbo's too hard, can we do like a jambalaya? Can we do like something that kind of connects? Because I think that is very home, and especially not living in Louisiana for so many years now. I mean, I still every single time I'm like, gotta go get my few things that I'm so used to having. So I think it would be no different in space.
So you wouldn't be standing on the gantry about to enter the rocket ship. You go, is my gumbo on there? And they go, no,
Uh,
I'm done. I'm leaving.
yeah,
Going
yeah,
down.
well, yeah. Got to make sure it's packed.
Excellent. So back to sort of a more sort of I guess heavy, not heavy question, but like so you're getting your PhD. So is TJ. TJ's in the difficult process of earning a PhD. And you wrote that becoming an astronaut and getting a master's or a PhD in a STEM field, it's resource intensive, it's time intensive, and you wrote that resources by means of foundations, scholarships, and grants are available. Do you have any recommendations for those who want to research like a Martian relevant project? Because full disclosure, I'm starting to research how to create a nuclear reactor that's could be used on Mars, because we have Krusty. NASA made Krusty, I think, in 2018, but it only made a kilowatt of power. We need a lot more energy to do anything on Mars. So I think that's a field that needs to be explored to have there be settlements on Mars. Do you know of any sort of grants or scholarships that people can apply to if they're interested in being an astronaut or doing a Mars relevant project?
Yeah, I think for that, it's so specific to what you're working on. I think that, for me and my field, I work a lot with NASA's Astrobiology division, looking for any like funding opportunities there. We've applied to like NASA grants a few times. The NASA's Finest is a really, really cool opportunity to, you kind of, essentially it's a very long pitch of your whole idea, and then they select and fund several of those projects every year. So I know that that's a really good resource. Yeah, I think it's really just keeping an eye open. If you aren't familiar with the ROSES, NASA's ROSES, uh, it's essentially where they put kind of all of their potential grants, and they kind of divide it out depending on, topics. So, for most of my stuff, it's a lot of planetary protection, habitable worlds, kind of looking more so specifically in like those divisions. So yeah, monies come and go, I think, a lot with funding, and like resources, especially from a research side, because it just kind of depends on, what they think is kind of the most important stuff to be had. But yeah, it's really just kind of keeping an eye out for those things. And I think generally, like whenever, you're pursuing like an interest in space, I mean, for me growing up, I was always kind of looking for any sort of like little scholarship or things. When I first started learning to fly, hearing about the 99s, which was like the women's organization, and seeing, the scholarships that they offered. And so I think it's, there's so many, I guess, like niche scholarships. So I think, whatever your topic is, especially for like young kids as well, and in high school and things like that, there's a lot of those like niche ones that you can really kind of start looking for and getting funding for. So yeah, I mean, that would just be my best advice, is just try to research as much to get as specific to your topic, because then you more align with what they're looking for, right? If it's, a grant, specifically for, from the NASA astrobiology, then hopefully I would have a better shot than just applying to a more like broad field. So yeah, I usually just try to keep it as specific as possible. And then especially with research, craftiness when there's not funding. So being able to get crafty maybe when there isn't as much.
Excellent, thank you. In the beginning of this conversation, Alyssa, you mentioned how with your field of research, astrobiology, you're preparing for being able to identify what is life on Mars. But another field that I'm curious to know if you are researching microbes, meaning I just read a book called Becoming Martian. I recommend it to all of you. It's by Scott Solomon, just came out, I think, a month ago. And he really looks at the challenges of going to Mars and living there. And one of them, where there's a lot of mystery, is microbes. Like the microbes in the ISS, it's like the equivalent of someone's house, in that there's, you have a lot of people living in a small space, you have microbes. But you wrote, which is very interesting, on page 133, that salmonella bacteria is over 3 times more hostile in space. And astronauts that have had viruses and they go into space, they're reactivated. So what do you think we should do for research going forward to understand microbes, and what's just your general knowledge on where we are now in microbes?
Yeah, great question. Well, my research is entirely on microorganisms in Martian environments. So, yeah, it's what I'm studying now. More specifically, I guess first from just the general microorganisms and their possibility on Mars. So obviously, I think if we're looking at any potential life on Mars, microorganisms are much more likely. Actually, if we're looking at potential life in our solar system, because we have other areas of interest as well beside Mars, we're also very curious about Titan, which is a moon of Saturn. We're very curious about Europa, Enceladus, some of those moons of Jupiter. And that's all just in relation to the potential of microorganisms growing in those environments. And that's just because they really can adapt very easily. And so, what I'm kind of studying specifically in relation to Mars is in connection to methane production, because essentially some of the rovers that we've had on Mars have detected trace amounts of methane. But in terms of our satellites, there is no methane in Mars's, greater atmosphere, which makes sense because from our knowledge, we think that if there was methane at some point on Mars, it should have dissipated by now. So it's very odd to find traces of methane, especially near the surface. So a really big idea is that there must be some source generating that methane, since it should not be there any longer in terms of Mars's kind of timeline. And so we're thinking there's something generating it subsurface, and then it's being excreted kind of at the surface. Maybe as the rover drove over, it kind of shifts and causes cracks and has, some methane coming out. And so obviously there's multiple possibilities there. There are geological processes that can generate methane. And then I'm just taking it from the perspective of the potential of, if there were to have been microorganisms there generating that methane, is that even possible? And so I work with methanogens, which are really common on Earth. They're one of our biggest methane producers here. And they're purely anaerobic, so they don't grow in oxygen. They're fully subsurface here on Earth or in the oceans as well. And so, yeah, we put those in Martian environments to see, can they survive under Martian pressure? How do they react with Martian materials and minerals? So that's kind of where my area of research comes in. But the idea of also the human perspective of it, it's a really big topic right now. I go to the astrobiology conferences, and they're every other year. And 2 years ago, there was a really fascinating experiment that they've been doing up on the International Space Station to really have good ideas of how resilient maybe some of these organisms are. And they actually had an astronaut, when he went on his spacewalk, to swab the outside of his glove, which is exposed to the vacuum of space, and start getting that information, because somehow things still come out. Things are still kind of being grown and showing up. And so I think it's definitely just to kind of keep in mind. And I think that the International Space Station has been such a great, I think, tool to be able to test things in microgravity environments, to kind of gain a little bit more knowledge on them. And I think as we turn to maybe, going back to the moon and Mars, a lot of those conversations are coming up even more with the idea of kind of planetary protection, because that field has kind of grown a lot in recent years. So I think, I think there's a lot more research to be done there, and we'll kind of see where it goes.
Fascinating. Yes, and you mentioned earlier that the microbes adapt, but they also evolve. In this book I read, I mean, they've found microbes on the ISS that are they've never encountered them before.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see if our bodies can handle them. But I mean, the human body is very adaptable too, so that's kind
Right.
in the beginning you mentioned possum training, POSSUM training. Can you talk a little bit about that and the most difficult part of that? Because I think in the book you mentioned that it was hard. Um,
Yeah, so Possum, which nowadays I think Alex mentioned, which is IIAS now, they're a little bit more official. They got accredited and stuff through the universities that they've been working under. But when I first found out about them, they were called Possum, and their main area of focus in the beginning was a lot around noctilucent clouds, which is a type of cloud that really only forms in very northern like the northern hemisphere, and so there's a lot of research that they were doing there, and I actually found out about them. It was so strange. I went to a camp over the summer, and the camp counselor at the time, she was just a college student at Embry-Riddle, and IIS started at Embry-Riddle, and I was just telling her about my interest in space and my kind of more interest in kind of a lot of the science side, and she was like, well, there's this program at my university. I have no idea what they do or anything about them, but maybe reach out to them. And so I got in contact with them, just kind of learn a little bit more about what they were doing. And yeah, it just turned into such an amazing opportunity. They're such amazing people. I've been able to do work with Final Frontier spacesuit design. We've done underwater EVA simulations. We've done so many different things, and I think working with them and kind of being involved in some of these things, I think again really just showed me how cool some of this stuff can be, and it was all for a scientific purpose, right? They were all for like research purposes, and so I think that that was kind of some of those early things that really gained my curiosity of like, wait, this is cool that we can just kind of go do this really fun thing and then like actually be learning something fun about it. Or even like with Final Frontier, it's cool that we can kind of throw on and wear a spacesuit and then actually provide valuable data back to the spacesuit company. So I think yeah, they were definitely one of the ones that really kind of, I think, inspired a lot of this research knowledge. But yeah, they're just an awesome organization.
Thank you. Back to TJ, who says she has another question.
Okay. Jumping back to previous question. Are there any particular concerns or threats concerning antibiotic resistance, or maybe exciting research where you mentioned how you want, or you're passionate about how things are always brought back to Earth within the space industry? What's going on with any research in that area, and maybe what it could do for helping fight problems here as well?
Yeah, I think that it's been a really fascinating field of how space is affecting the human body and how that affects astronauts. I think one of the coolest studies that they did was the twin study with the Scott Kelly, the Kelly twins. They were two brothers and they're both astronauts, and then one lived on the International Space Station for a year and the other one stayed on Earth for a year. And yeah, there's been a lot of research coming from that. Random things of like, how is space affecting our eyes and how is space affecting this and that. And so I think that that's really been, I think, a big part. And almost any astronaut, honestly, that's come back to from space. I mean, there's such intensive, pre-medical and then post-medical things from just the simple fact of going into space and coming back. And so yeah, I think a little bit less of my direct knowledge of it. I guess I just know more of like the headlines there, but I do think that it's definitely an important field. And again, if talking more so with missions to Mars and missions, longer term missions to the moon, all those come into play even more, right? Because the longer time you're in space, the more potential damage or the more of whatever is happening, right? Your bone density getting less, your muscles getting weaker from just being exposed to microgravity for that long. And even something like a Mars mission, Mars has gravity, which is great, but it is not as much gravity here on Earth. So you're still going to have those changes to your body. And so I think a lot of those are kind of those big question marks that we kind of need to have some sort of solution to before sending humans to Mars. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's really why astronauts like working out is like one of their biggest parts of their day on the International Space Station, is just to try to keep their bodies as like fit as possible. And then I guess in terms of, from the microbiology side of things, I think that bringing things back has always been a little bit of a concern as well. Going back to when we first went to the moons, the astronauts were like quarantined after they came back from the moon and put in like trailers because they thought they had like moon bugs. So I think that it's always been a topic that's been relevant, right? Even if it's not moon bugs, but it's always been kind of at the forefront of these missions.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you, Alyssa. Back to Alex.
Alyssa, most of my questions, the ones that float through my head, are all personality questions, or more so team oriented type questions versus the technical. You've been doing this for a very long time, since 6 years old. Maybe didn't know it then, but probably are used to it now over the years doing this for so long. It's like driving a car. You know, you don't have to think about it, you just do it. But with the type of training that you do, all of the different skill stacks that you have to stack and maintain for when it does come time for astronaut candidacy, your selection board, and so on and so forth. What keeps you going every single day? What's something that makes you excited every single morning to wake up and do this type of work? What gets Alyssa Carson excited? Is it do you drink a cup of coffee?
Oh
What's
yeah.
the special sauce? What's the special sauce that you use? Or is there a special sauce, or just something that's intuitively already within you, or something you've developed? What is it?
Yeah, I think there's multiple directions there. I mean, I think one thing that's been motivating me throughout the years, I mean, I think I've just kind of always had this innate like passion for space. Anything space related, I was instantly much more hooked, much more interested in the conversation and learning about it. I would kind of have topics in school and I was like, yeah, this is cool, I guess. But then, learning about it from the space perspective and space side, I was like, wow, this is so much more interesting. So I feel like I've always been naturally a little bit more drawn to space topics, which I think has kind of led or really helped, a lot of my passion there. As far as like, I guess just like motivation, especially in like learning new skills and things like that, I think growing up, I was always trying different things, right? Because I didn't fully know what career path I wanted to do. Did I want to be a pilot? Did I want to do science? Did I want to study robotics? Did I want to be an engineer? I had no idea, right? There were so many possibilities. And so I feel like I kind of put myself or, was interested in trying a little bit of these different fields. And, as I started doing that, I think what I started to appreciate even more than the skills themselves was how much I was learning about myself. And when I started to learn to fly, I think that was a great example of, I went to my first flight lesson and I hated it. And I said, well, this just isn't for me. I'm not going to do it. And then my dad encouraged me to go at least one more time to really make sure. He's like, if you don't like it again, then like you don't need to do it. You don't have to become a pilot. No one's like making you do that. And so I went again, and then I came back and I was like, this was the coolest thing ever. And so I think a lot of the time I've been put in these situations where I've almost pushed myself, and then now I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and whether, I'm not necessarily pursuing being a pilot professionally these days, but, I feel like I learned so many skills and so much about myself through that process that I think I appreciate so much. And I think that that's just kind of made me, well, let's try something else new. How else can I kind of push myself, and what other new thing can I learn about myself in these new skills? So I think, some of those initial opportunities may have been difficult to jump into, but I think my takeaways, I'm like, wow, that was really amazing. I should try something else like that, just because I feel like it's just growing as a person.
Just gonna add something to that. That was really awesome response there. Just something to add to that question was a lot of negativity going around the world. I try not to pay attention to any of those things. All I do is try and focus on the mission and be good to the people that are around me. What it looks like you have here in your background, I'm pretty sure you try to do this. Not only you doing all the training all the time, so that keeps you focused. Probably the people that you surround yourself, those are great people as well. Do you have to have a filter? Or do you use psychological priming that you do? Like people go to a Starbucks to study, right? Or they go to a library to study. They use that psychological priming. How important is your environment to you to stay focused on everything that you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I definitely have a lot of those personality traits. Like if, my house is a mess, I'm probably a mess at that time. Like where, you kind of, uh, like melt into your environment in a way. And so I think that all that is just as important. I think for me in such an ambitious goal, I think it's always been important to kind of surround yourself with people that support you. And I think that's been super big. I always try to encourage, students to have at least some some person supporting you, whether it's a parent, a friend, a teacher, whoever it is. I mean, growing up, luckily, my dad was so supportive of all of my space, endeavors. And I was so lucky to have that because, if he was constantly being like, no, we're not going to go to this space thing, then, that would have been very challenging to kind of keep pursuing my, passions without, constantly being dragged down on it. And so, yeah, I think just kind of surrounding myself with people that kind of are supportive of my interests and my fascinations. And it's been also interesting just getting more into the community of it all as well. I think that the space industry is such a community. The astrobiology field is such a community. Going from Louisiana, where space was like not a very common area of interest, to then when I went to undergrad, moving to Florida and living on the Space Coast and seeing rocket launches every other weekend, and kind of surrounding your environment that is uplifting to your goals, I think makes a really big difference. So I think, whether it's been intentional or not, it's been definitely a part of that journey and kind of supporting my dreams from the background.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alyssa. Bert, I'm not sure if you're there, but Alyssa or Bert, you can answer this. Was Bert, are you a space enthusiast as well? Because reading clearly always supportive of Alyssa and her path. And I think you were even a little surprised that at such a young age, Alyssa showed this passion for space. Have you always been interested in the Apollo missions and all of that, or have you kind of learned it as Alyssa has learned it?
No, I mean, when I was a young kid, obviously, we were going to the moon and I witnessed the moon landing and that kind of thing. And I was very interested in all that. I actually have a lot of old space items or whatever that I've kind of mixed in with Alyssa's stuff. Why I didn't pursue it, I don't know. And especially since I went into the video world, I could have just as easily went to work for NASA doing video. So I guess it was there as a young kid, but I guess didn't last. And then yes, obviously I have learned a lot more about space and everything through her. I say all the time, like I didn't push her into this; she's pulled me in. But yeah, she 3, 4 years old came to me asking about Mars. And I'm like, sure, you can do that. You can become an astronaut. And honestly figured, a week later she'd want to be a princess and 2 weeks later be a frog and, whatever. I never thought she would stay this laser focused. And, and because of that, that's why she's where she's at today, is because of the hard work that she's put in every day to go after this dream.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I promised Alyssa 1 hour. So I have one more question to wrap it up. But I was going to say Josh was a reader who just popped in and then left. I think he's at work. So if anyone else has one more question, you can ask it. But this is kind of a specific question, but I wanted to make sure I brought it up with you. So I'm also interested in growing plants in space, and I believe that there's a dearth of knowledge about this. I tried to look on Amazon and Google, and there really aren't that many books about growing plants in space that are really that I think are extensive. You wrote on page 47 that you grew plants at the Florida Institute of Technology in a Mars box. What have you learned about growing plants in space, and will you keep researching it? Where do you think the field is at?
Yeah, so the lab that I worked in at Florida Tech was all about plants and growing them. My contributions to the project were a little bit more from the microorganism side, just because we were working with plant growth promoting bacteria. So it's essentially organisms that you add to the plants to basically help them grow better. And we were trying to understand a little bit about them, and is it beneficial to send those organisms with the plants into space to kind of help them grow better. If you're using that as food supply, you're wanting to get the most yield possible. But our lab, yeah, we had so many amazing people that were kind of had so many different projects. But the guy in charge of the lab, he worked with Heinz and growing you can definitely find some the information about it, but he like grew tomato plants as like a collaboration with Heinz to be like ketchup on Mars. It was kind of like a quirky thing, but yeah, he was trying to grow the tomato plants using like different regoliths and stuff. So I think a lot has been there. I think we've gained a lot of knowledge. I think one of the hardest parts is, we don't have a single sample from Mars. And so all of the ideas surrounding, growing plants there is a little iffy, right? We have the regolith, we have, the knowledge that we've gained from some of the missions, but we actually don't have a single sample directly from Mars, right? And so some of that can be challenging when kind of doing some of these studies. But I think that it's an ever-growing field. I was very happy to kind of contribute to some of the stuff in that lab, especially from, my microbiology side. But yeah, I think today maybe I don't keep up with it as much. When I was switching to a PhD, I was kind of at the moment very excited to leave the plants behind. I was in the interested in, I guess, a little bit of a shift just in like research topic. I felt like I had heard so much about plants that I was so ready to kind of just shift gears a bit. But yeah, I think that it's something that we're continuing to see. I think hydroponics are just getting better and better. I mean, people can have full-fledged gardens like in their house now so easily with those systems. So I think it's just getting even better.
Great. Yes, we had Kim Stanley Robinson in a previous talk, and he wrote a book called Red Mars. But he said, yeah, there's percolates, there's like poison in the soil on Mars, and we either have to wash the poison out or grow plants just not even in soil at all.
Right.
I'll be interested to see how we overcome that. All right. Does anyone have any other questions? This is really, I know I only said one more, but Jared Isaacman recently mentioned in an interview that optimistic projection for humans to Mars, 10 years, if there's the political will behind it. Is that do you believe we'll have humans on Mars in 10 years, or are you just kind of open to based off, because you're very much involved in the community? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's I think we have to have optimism in space. I think it's hard to work towards a mission of especially such a large mission without optimism. Some of these things are so difficult and sometimes it's hard. You just kind of have to like push through some of those. I think that honestly, my personal opinion with the mission to Mars, I think one of our greatest challenges kind of keeping us, because I do think we still have some question marks about logistics of this mission. And I think the biggest thing holding us back at the moment is timeline. I think that with the current technology, current mission of, it taking 6 months to get to Mars, staying on Mars for X amount of time, 6 to 9 months to come back, I think it's too grand scale of a mission, too long of a mission, especially in comparison to what types of missions we currently have the capabilities of doing and what we're currently looking at doing with the moon and things like that. So to me, I think that's the biggest kind of issue. I know that they've been working a lot on newer engines to get that timeline from Earth to Mars from 6 months to 6 weeks, which I think would be a huge victory in terms of like a mission to Mars. So I'm not quite as much from the engineering side, so I don't know how challenging a lot of that stuff is, or how long it's going to necessarily take for that technology to be at that point. But I know it's been a thought for a while, and so I think for me that's my hopes, is if the timeline can be a little bit more, I guess, realistic to what we're used to doing, then I think a mission to Mars becomes a lot more possible. And again, that kind of has its optimism of we're going to be able to figure that technology out and make that possible. But I do think that that's kind of, from my perspective, would be one of our biggest things to overcome to make that mission possible. So we'll see. I mean, I think that everything going on right now with Artemis and getting back to the moon is like a great first step. I know that NASA had, kind of in conversations, the idea of permanent presence to a degree on the moon, by 2028, 2029. So we'll see what permanent presence fully means and kind of how some of that may be able to aid in a mission to Mars.
Excellent, thank you. And I think Jared Isaacman said nuclear propulsion might be a way that we'll do that. TJ said she had one last final quick question, so I'll let her
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other than your book, of course, if there's one book that you'd recommend for everyone to read, context or not, what would you recommend?
Huh, that's interesting. Well, I don't know. I actually would say what's been on my mind more recently is Hail Mary with like the movie coming out. So that has just kind of naturally been on my mind a little bit more. So yeah, that's really my first thought. I know that also same author Artemis was is very, very very popular and very well respected. Heard very good things there. So yeah, I mean, those are kind of mainly the ones on my mind. So I guess those would be my recommendations.
And that reminds me of a Plants in Space book of The Martian. So
You're
that's
right.
the only
Yeah.
one I can think of.
All ties together.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
yes, thank you so much, Alyssa. Really enjoyed this conversation. It's recorded so our readers can watch it at their own time. Um, Best of luck in your life and career, and for those of you who haven't bought the book, I just saw in the chat that Alex said he just got it on Amazon. Worth a read and inspiring too. I mean, after I read it, I wanted to become an astronaut. So I think that's the goal. I imagine to inspire. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for reading it and for having me to talk about it.
Great. Have a good day, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.